Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Second Son Woodworks. My name is Caleb, and today I'm going to be talking about a few different things with regard to a memory box that I have been building. There's a few other episodes related to this series. Check those out if you haven't. I'll put links up above and in the description below. But today I'm going to be talking about the lid for the box, the lid and the base of the box that I'll be doing kind of a special chamfer using a router table and my table saw. Stay tuned, this is going to be a pretty cool little trick to enhance the quality and the aesthetic appeal of your boxes. Also, I will do just a little bit of coverage over how to do dado cuts to insert the lid and the base of the box into the sidewalls. Thus far, what you have been watching me do is cut 4 separate pieces on my miter saw of some red oak that I will be using for the base and the lid of the box. These 4 separate pieces will be glued up 2 at a time to make up the 2 different pieces, the lid and the base of the box. For those of you who are new to my channel, thanks for checking out this video and welcome to Second Son Woodworks. If you like what you're seeing thus far, you should hit the subscribe button below. I have lots of other videos on my channel that will be helpful if you like to work with wood and do other DIY projects. Once I had the 4 separate pieces cut down to the correct length, I took them over to my benchtop joiner to smooth up the edges so that when I glue them together they would sit nice and flush together and make up a larger sheet or a larger board that would make up the base and the lid of the box. After that, I took the 4 separate pieces over to my workbench and I used a couple bar clamps. If you're new to woodworking, bar clamps are going to be probably your cheapest option for getting lots of clamps and clamps that work really well. So I went ahead and glued up 2 pieces together twice so that I ended up having 2 separate panels that were large enough to make up the base and the lid for this memory box. Whenever you're doing a glue up like this, it's a good idea to make sure that the boards don't buckle as you tighten the clamps. Make sure that they stay up against the clamp bars so that you get a nice flat board. Once the 2 glue ups had dried overnight, I took them out of the clamps and I took them over to my table saw and I squared them up so that they were the exact size that they needed to be in order to fit into the dado cuts that I'd eventually be cutting into the side walls of the box that I did in the episode previous to this one. Now, in order to get this inverted chamfer you can see on the lid, and it will also be on the base of the box, you have to take the panels that will make up the base and the lid of the box, and you first have to cut a half lap type joint type cut around each of the 4 edges on one face, so that then when you insert the lid into the dado cuts on the walls, the chamfer will be a bit farther in to the panel itself. This is kind of a difficult process to explain, so continue watching as I set up my table saw to do some shallow cuts around the 4 sides of one of the panels. And I do that just about ½ an inch into the side of the panel, and then I'll flip over the panel and cut out the section. You can see here that I penciled out the section on that corner that I'll want to be cutting out. Now, the reason you want to make these cuts on your table saw before you go to make the cuts on your router table is so that then it will enable the chamfer, the inverted chamfer, to be inset into the side of the panel, and then, like I said, there will be enough space for you to still place the panel into those dado cuts, and then the chamfer itself will be not completely flush, obviously, with the dado cuts, and that will make a little bit more sense after I complete these cuts. When I had a client come to me and ask me to build this box that I picture up here on the left, I wasn't sure exactly how to do this cut, and it took a little bit of troubleshooting to figure out how I could create this chamfer, as well as be able to insert the panels into dado cuts. But then I figured it out, and this really worked out well. I ended up using a feather board to complete a number of these cuts, just because of how tight and small the cut was. I wanted to make sure that the blade didn't move too much, so using a feather board is a great option. To reiterate this process, you can see here that I'm cutting these 4 grooves, kind of like half-lap joints, on 4 edges of one of the faces of each of the boards. And when I was done with this, man, I gotta say, it felt good to have those cuts done right. So I decided to do a celebratory dance. Alright, sorry about that. That was a little bit awkward. Let's get back to the build. You can see here as I'm finishing up the cuts on one of these panels how I get those kind of half-lap type grooves on 4 sides of the panel, and I'll be doing this on both the lid and the base of the box. And the reason being so that when I go over to my router table to cut the actual inverted chamfers, as you might want to call them, I don't know if that's the exact term, but then the fence itself will be able to set back enough to do those grooves. I also made sure to set this bit on my router high enough so that it didn't go beyond the depth of those cuts on the face panel, but then it would end up doing the inverted round groove on the section that was kind of into the side of the panel. This is such a hard thing to explain, so just keep watching and it'll make a bit more sense. Alright, now as I promised, I will also be discussing some dado cuts that I will be doing on the inside faces of the walls of the box. I cut these down in a video previous to this. If you haven't checked that out, you should watch it. But to do these dado cuts, I'm just using my table saw, super simple, and I'm doing multiple passes. I didn't switch out for the dado blade set. Instead, I'm just using the blade that is already installed. And then I slowly just move the fence over after I do each of the passes so that I could get the same width of those 2 panels that I just added those crazy chamfer groove things. Now, this was kind of the reason why I had to do those chamfer bits after I cut the grooves with my table saw earlier on in the video, because I wanted the two different panels to sit into these dado cuts. They're grooves where the wood can sit into, and then I can just use some glue and it will be a really tight hold that will never move after you added the glue and clamp it up, let it dry, which I'll do here in a second. I think for some people who are very inexperienced with woodworking assume that every piece has to have some sort of screw or even a nail, but that's not actually the case. Most of the time when you are building projects like this, you don't want those things. It's better to just have some sort of joint. Whenever I do dado cuts like this with just using the regular blade that's in my table saw, I have to come back to those different dado cuts and use a chisel to get out the excess small little pieces of wood that are left over. These will just chip right out if you've done multiple passes, which makes it pretty easy. You can see here that I'm lining up the 4 separate walls of the box according to their grain. The previous video in this series talks about continuous grain. If you haven't seen that, make sure you check it out. And then I went ahead and slid in the lid and the base of the box and made sure everything fit by using a strap clamp to tighten everything together, see if there's any adjustments that need to be made before I do the actual gluing. I should also note that it's important to do the sanding of the majority of the box before you glue it up. It'll save you so much time if you do it before the box is glued up and there's lots of tight corners. I also decided to use a round over bit on the router table to round over some of the edges on the inside portion of the box, the edges that are lining up with that chamfer, whatever you want to call it, groove that I did earlier. And so I need to do these grooves or these roundovers with the 1/4 round bit on the router before I glue it up. So you can see here that I'm putting in the bit. Whenever I'm using a roundover bit or a bit like this on my router table and there is a decent amount of adjustment you can do with the height, it's a good idea to test out the cut before you start doing it on your final piece. But you can see here that I'm just going ahead and rounding over that inside edge as well as the outside edge on each of the walls. But I made sure not to do it on the side where there is the 45-degree angle, obviously. I didn't do as many roundover edges on the previous box, the prototype box that I built. There's a few videos on that. If you haven't checked those out, check them out. But I'm really excited with how it turned out doing it on this box. Once I had finished doing those roundover cuts on the router table, I went ahead and sanded everything down with 120 grit sandpaper. Like I said, it's such a good idea to do the majority of the sanding before you glue up the box so that you don't have to spend so much time trying to get into tight little corners and whatnot. Then once the sanding was complete, it was time to go ahead and glue the entire box up. This is always a little bit of a angsty process, but if you do a couple dry fits before you do the actual glue up, then it should go pretty well. And you want to make sure to rub the glue everywhere. Try not to get it past the edges because the squeeze out that will happen you have to get rid of, and so it's saving yourself work if you don't have as much squeeze out. Alright folks, that's it for this episode of Second Son Woodworks. I hope that you learned just a bit about some different woodworking techniques. Make sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Leave a comment or a question below, and check out all of my other videos. I got lots of good stuff in my library, and like I always say, get in the shop, build something cool. Take care, guys.